Good evening, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and welcome back to another video that we're doing. And today we're actually talking about 1968 and kind of the history of political campaigning. Now, I know I should probably go back, and I guess I will, to talk about 1960. We'll start with 1960, I guess. Which, hilariously, both of these are elections that involve Richard Nixon. And yeah, so 1960 was a little interesting. Now there was some dodginess regarding Illinois, but Illinois wouldn't have changed the result of the election. So honestly, I don't know why a lot of people talk about Illinois, but whatever. 1960 was unique, or I guess I guess we'll say unique. It was the first election in American history where television was an important deciding factor. And this is kind of highlighted by the fact that there was a presidential debate, of course, between Richard Nixon and JFK. And the debate was both broadcast over radio and it was televised. Those who listened to the radio broadcast thought that Nixon had won, and this matters because those who had listened to the radio broadcast who thought that Nixon had won, they only had what the candidate said. They only had the substance of the debate, how they answered the questions, the tone of their voice, their policy positions. Those who had seen the debate on television, however, they thought that Kennedy had won. And this is highlighted by a few things, or caused by a few things. First, Nixon refused to shave before the debate. Second, he refused to wear makeup. So he came off as, at least in terms of the image that was broadcast on television, it looked like he was tired, disheveled, sweaty, maybe even ill. Whereas Kennedy, who understood that looking presentable was part of television, he looked professional, calm, clean, presidential. And this tremendously helped Kennedy. Most people assumed that Nixon, who was campaigning close to what close to the Eisenhower positions, because Nixon was Eisenhower's vice president, and conventional wisdom is if you're tied to a popular president, you should really campaign hard on your connections to that president, that Nixon would pull away with it if he had a good debate, which, to those who listened to him on the radio, clearly thought he did. And I would argue that Nixon did win that debate, at least in terms of the substance, but Kennedy was obviously the real winner there because of the effect that it had on how people campaigned, where television became a mainstream tool for candidates to promote their positions. Now, here's the other thing. If I go here and fill it in, we have a hung election. By the way, Missouri tended to vote at the time for the winning candidate. Anyway, we fast forward to the next election, 1964. We look at the beginning of one of the key points of the 1968 was a realignment election where all the Southern racists all of a sudden started voting Republican, and the normal people started voting Democratic. Myth. It's sort of a myth. It's a vast oversimplification of what actually happened. That was caused because Barry Goldwater was a conservative, and Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was actually racist. Seriously, look at some of the stuff he said about black people. But he signed the Civil Rights Act and promoted the Great Society, so he gets a pass. He also used to wave his Johnson around politicians to intimidate them. That's not a joke. That is actually a documented fact. In his retirement, he liked to scare people in his amphibious car by joking that the brakes had gone out and driving into a lake. Again, not a joke. That's something that actually happened. Repeatedly. Barry Goldwater had voted against the Civil Rights Act because he thought it was too much government, which I think was a bit of a naive position to have, because really the Civil Rights Act was government being used to take on bad government. Basically, they were fighting against Jim Crow, right? But Barry Goldwater, of course, being the typical, I think most people would call them the paleo-conservative movement, the group that kind of gave birth to modern conservatism in some way, shape, or form. Very fiscally focused and oriented, very focused on small government and allowing states to have a lot of leeway, stuff like that. He was kind of the founder of this modern conservative movement in many ways. And Nixon actually campaigned hard for him because Nixon did want to be president still. And he recognized that supporting Barry Goldwater in a year where he's probably going to lose and lose bad is going to at least reflect well on him in the next primary series. Because he's going to have that Eisenhower connection. He's still relatively moderate on policy. And if he looks like a party loyalist, it's going to make it a lot easier for conservatives to say, yeah, we'll accept this guy. He may not be perfect, but we'll accept him. In addition, there's the advent of television advertising in this election, with the Republicans running the "in your heart, you know he's right" moment for Barry Goldwater, whereas the Democrats ran the "in your guts, you know he's nuts." Because Barry Goldwater did admittedly have a penchant for advocating for the use of nuclear weapons in Vietnam. That's not a joke. And of course, he coined the phrase, "There is no extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice." Of course, a lot of people will say, "Whoa, pump the brakes there, Barry." Whereas a person like me will say, "Yeah, I mean, duh. If you're defending liberty, being extreme about it is not a problem. I mean, it's liberty. Come on." But as we all know, it didn't end well for Barry Goldwater. So let's move to the next election, 1968, where everything kind of came to a head. Because the Democrats were definitely moving in a more socially liberal position that the South was not a fan of. Now, for well over 100 years, the South had been voting pretty much not just straight ticket Democrat, but dictatorial levels of straight ticket Democrat, to the point where dictators like damn, how did they get so much support in the South? In my own rigged elections, I can only get 88% of the vote. Slight joke, obviously. Whereas the Democrats in South Carolina, for example, had been running up the margins at like 95% of the vote in a normal year. Well, this was kind of a weird three-way election. There was, of course, Richard Nixon, who said, yeah, I'm running for president. There was Hubert Humphrey, who was the Liberal vice president. And he was from New England, if I remember correctly. He was somewhat socially liberal, but he tried to at least keep to the core tenets of the Democratic Party, which was the New Deal still, as well as the expansion of the Great Society. And then there was George Wallace, whose most famous quote is, of course, the segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And I can't do a good George Wallace impression. I can do a good Bill Clinton impression, though. Yeah, I can't do George Wallace. But he was the governor of Alabama. And he didn't like the direction Democrats were moving. So he decided, yeah, I'm gonna run for president. I don't care if I'm gonna come close to winning or not. I really don't. I just want to throw it to the House and get a less crazy Democrat as president. And by the way, George Wallace remained a Democrat for life, minus his stint as the American Independent Party candidate in 1968. And this includes after he got shot and supposedly changed his mind about race relations. Yeah, there's some interesting debate about that. By the way, Strom Thurmond from South Carolina, we talked about him last time I covered campaigning. He'd become a Republican by this point because of the Civil Rights Act. He was the only Democrat in actually either chamber of Congress to change his political party over it. Al Gore Sr. remained Democrat. Harry Byrd remained Democrat. Basically, every single Democrat who filibustered the Civil Rights Act remained a Democrat for life. Now, my research on this election and the circumstances surrounding it is surprisingly deep. My second year college history paper was actually on this election. And the conclusion I came to was the South was changing parties, but it had almost nothing to do with racial relations and almost everything to do with the Democrats becoming oriented towards big government, not necessarily the average person. Because if we remember, the old Democratic Party, the old South, the antebellum South, was an agrarian party. It was a party focused on farmers, on popular sovereignty, and that is specifically referencing slavery, but also the idea of actual democracy, let the people have more say, as well as low taxes, low tariffs, but also low taxes in general, and more leniency towards whatever the states wanted to do. Whereas this new Democratic Party that had started to form under Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, was more oriented towards big government, towards centralization of power, towards increased taxation. And this just wasn't the opinion of the South. It almost never was up until recent times when you got a bunch of Yanks coming down and telling us how we should live our lives down here. But FDR is actually when the African American vote started to shift towards the Democrats. In 1960, Richard Nixon actually got 40% of black voters to vote for him. This, of course, kind of died after him, and Republicans have had a difficult time cracking 10% since. But it's important to note that Democrats wound up getting the African American voter simply because the New Deal at least looked as if the government was trying to do something. Whereas Republicans, their opinion then, as is now, is basically government spending? What? Are you insane? Admittedly, Republicans also have a penchant for military spending, so that's not exactly the same, but, Republicans aren't exactly the type to spend a ton of money on social welfare. They never have been. They've always been the party that is about trade, expansion of American business, they've just added in the part of the Democratic platform that appealed to the South, which was states' rights, which had changed since the Civil War to mean not slavery, but just let the states manage their own policies on a lot of issues, as well as decentralization of power in the United States. And the South generally likes that because the southern states tend to be a little bit more independent than, say, the New England states and the Midwestern states. The South still considers themselves to be having a rivalry with the North. North is like, southern states, they exist. They're kind of backwards, but the South is, on the other hand, yeah, we don't want them Yanks coming down here and telling us how to live our lives. And it's still true. Now, as for did George Wallace help Richard Nixon or Hubert Humphrey, chances are Wallace hurt Nixon more than he helped Humphrey. Or more than he hurt Humphrey. And this is because most voters in 68 stated that, most Wallace voters in 68 stated that their second choice was Nixon. And that's because Nixon, even though he supported Brown v. Board of Education and the policies that Eisenhower had implemented to enforce Brown v. Board, as well as the other Supreme Court decisions regarding civil rights in that era, Nixon was the type of candidate who said, yeah, we have to give them civil rights, we have to follow the law, African Americans, black people have rights. But he was also the candidate who was standing up against the riots that were happening at the DNC, in Baltimore, and other major cities, saying they need to calm down. There is a place for police and civil rights. And that was pretty much the platform that Nixon was running on. And I'm going to try and end this fairly shortly before I move on to the next segment. And this is really the birth of the true power of the newer conservative movement because, well, Nixon was able to win the presidency, obviously. And then the Democrats went hard to the liberal wing in the next election, 72. And they went for the extremely idealistic, basically Bernie Sanders of his era and George McGovern, and it did not end well. Nixon, of course, resigned, and Ford took over, rather than Agnew, who had resigned previously. And Ford actually came dangerously close to winning, if I remember correctly. Let's change that to Phil. Ohio wouldn't have been enough, but honestly, New York would have. Would Pennsylvania have been enough? No. But this was a very close election, surprisingly. I think a lot of people expected Ford to lose in a landslide at the onset. Jimmy Carter just wound up having too much of a lead to surmount, despite his ability to flub things. And it turned out the moment was too large for Carter. But this is kind of where the next era begins, because Ford was more of an Eisenhower style than a Nixon or later Republicans would be. Gerald Ford was kind of a bland president, but to be fair, he only had 2 years. He didn't have enough time to really establish his own method of governance. But he liked to be a moderate, and whenever he vetoed something, he proposed an alternate solution as a way of saying, hey, I'll work with you. You have an idea, let's work together on this. And there were a few other things. For example, he was willing to reach out to states and help them out if they were undergoing financial difficulties. New York is a prime example of that. But 1980 is kind of the next moment, and it's kind of where the transition from not just televised debates and television taking a little bit of prominence in electioneering to the moment when we start getting into almost meme type campaigning, soundbite focused when it comes to debates and ads, and a real focus on advertising. If y'all like the content, likes, comments, subscriptions, they always do help, and I greatly appreciate each and every single one of them. I have a Patreon. Link to that is in the description. I also have a Twitter. That link is somewhere on my channel, and if you want to follow it, cool. If not, cool. I mostly use it to tweet cat photos. So, anyway, I hope you all enjoyed. I'll see y'all next time. Take it easy. Bye bye.